Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Curriculum 30-minute bite-sized boosts, 6 recorded lunchtime sessions for K-6 teachers. My name is Cheryl Babin, and I am a designer of professional learning at the Calgary Regional Consortium. Thank you so much for tuning in today, whether you are here with me live or if you're catching the recording at a later time. In all of those circumstances, I appreciate your time and I commend you on the excellent work that you are doing, and I thank you for fitting this into your busy schedule. So we'll just begin with a land acknowledgement today. Excuse me. We are gathered here today in an important and sacred place within Treaty 7 and the traditional territories of the Nitsappi from the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, the Piikani, Kainai Nations, the Yahari Nakota of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley Nations, and the Dene of the Tsuut'ina Nation. Southern Alberta is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And as participants now gathered here in the heart of Treaty 7 territory, I'd like to acknowledge and honor that we have the ongoing responsibility and leadership to protect and honor all of the life within our shared reality as treaty people. As always, we like to make a reference to the First Peoples principles of learning. And while thinking about the best ways in which to embrace Indigenous ways of knowing and doing when considering how we implement curriculum, I'd like to make a point to note that today's session around assessment is really about, it makes a connection to the First Peoples way of understanding learning to be holistic, reflective, and experiential. And I hope that you'll see those tenets into the work that we discussed today. Today's session's about assessment foundations and freedoms. And there is a link to the slides there if you would like to follow along on those, or if you're catching up a little bit later and want to take some more time. I'm including quite a bit of information today that comes from Alberta Education, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to go back and see those slides at a later time as well, if you so need. And there's a QR code there if you'd like to grab it on your phone. 4 quick things today. We'll just talk about how with every mandate or rule, there are any, we might call those foundations. We will also see that there are freedoms. We'll look at some of the information that we have about the foundations or those expectations from Alberta Education, and then a little bit further into the freedoms that we have within the realm of assessment. We'll look at the relationship between the learning outcomes and the cusps and how that works with assessment. And we'll also offer you a couple of, I believe, very helpful tools to support your assessment for learning. So let's begin. If we understand that some of our foundations in terms of curriculum are changing, we know as well that with every foundation there are freedoms. And so let's just sort of lay it on the line here. A foundation is a non-negotiable, something we must do, and whether we will know that it is happening. A freedom is an opportunity or a chance to be creative, a chance to offer some choice and innovation. So today I will ask you what you will create, choose, and innovate with the freedoms within assessment. Let's start with the learning outcomes. Now this slide comes from Alberta Education and was shared with the Alberta Regional Professional Development Consortium at the beginning of the shift into new curriculum. And so this slide really articulates that the learning outcomes describe what students are required to know, understand, and be able to do by the end of a grade. And by the end of a grade is really an important component that we want to keep in mind when we're looking at benchmarks or the needs of students or how we might assess and report on that component. This learning outcome is the part of the curriculum that must be assessed and reported on to parents. It does not tell us exactly in what way we have to report. It's generally done on the report card, but to this date, there is not a consolidated or a similar reporting system across the province. So whatever you have within your district or your school is the way that you will decide how you report that information out. The learning outcomes are very subject specific, and it's important to note that each learning outcome includes one or more concepts that are the focus for the learning and the assessment. When we think about the learning outcome and the relationship to the guiding question and the organizing ideas, Alberta Education has provided us a couple of examples. So if we think about this learning outcome, I'm just looking at the bottom of this chart, students interpret and explain quantity to 100. So when we take the word quantity, which is a concept, we know that the guiding question illuminates that by saying, how can quantity be communicated? How do we share what we know about quantity? And even in a more broad and framing way, I'm struggling today, I'm sorry. The organizing idea determines that quantity is measured with numbers that enable counting, labeling, comparing, and operating. So that's the overarching idea. So I hope you can see that connection where quantity and number transcends all of those levels through the architecture of the curriculum right to the learning outcome. And then it weaves its way into the knowledge, understanding, skills, and procedures, which are called cusps or nicknamed cusps. The learning outcomes are supported by knowledge, understanding, skills, and procedures. Alberta Education talks about the knowledge-rich curriculum and the ways in which foundational knowledge facilitates the development of that background information and provides a foundation for critical thinking and the literacies that beyond that particular subject. And so it's important to remember that in order to use that knowledge, we must embed it into an understanding. Knowledge or facts alone, they are insignificant because they don't have a context or a way to be useful. So understanding is really important to help organize those knowledge statements and support students with the conceptual understanding that can come through those learning outcomes. Understandings within the cusps support students to apply or transfer new learning to other situations or contexts, which is where the use of those knowledge pieces really comes into play. The skills and procedures, the foundation of this, is really what students do to demonstrate their knowledge and understandings. And so when we're looking at this through the lens of assessment, we know that the requirement is that we address the curriculum content that falls within the knowledge, understanding, skills, and procedures, and that those elements actually support the learning outcome. So let's take a look at another example. Here's a grade 3 math example. And here we see the organizing idea. It's about shapes are defined and related by geometric attributes. The guiding question continues to see the concepts of geometric properties and the interpretations of shape. The learning outcome that would need to be assessed, students relate geometric properties to shape. Well, how do we do that? And so when we're thinking about assessment, we need to understand the pieces that build that learning outcome, and so that we are clear about the level of achievement or the complexity or the depth of understanding that a student's able to demonstrate. So in this particular learning outcome, the knowledge is represented through a student's ability to understand or to know what a transformation is and how it includes a translation, a rotation, or a reflection, and a reflection, I should say. And what do you do with that? So you might be able to describe what a translation is, but then in the understanding, you would want to be able to put it into context. So the geometric properties do not change when a polygon undergoes a transformation. So the shapes and the shape and the sides and the vertices would continue to be intact through a translation. And with the skill and procedure, a student would examine geometric properties of a polygon by translating, rotating, or reflecting. So they're using those shapes and practicing those skills, all the while being able to put it into that understanding which would then be assessed in terms of the learning outcome. I hope that this example is providing you some clarity with that. Please feel free to pop any questions into the chat or turn on your mic if you'd like to contribute. Here's another example, physical education and wellness from grade 5. Let's pop down to the organizing idea. Falls within the movement skill development. Developing physical literacy through movement and active living supports well-being across a lifespan. And so you can see the bolded letter or words are those concepts, those key things that will transcend the other layers of the architecture. The guiding question asks, how can diverse movement patterns contribute to success across physical activities? So movement patterns and physical activities. And then the learning outcome, students demonstrate and adapt various movement patterns to enhance skill development. Here, well, now in order to assess the learning outcome, we need to know what it is we have to do. This is the content that helps us to figure out how we're going to assess this. We're going to practice movement types sequences in 3 parts, such as run, turn, and catch. We're going to understand that movement patterns can be expanded to include new skills, and then we're going to practice sequencing and repeating movement patterns, all while engaging in different kinds of activities. So you can see how when it comes to assessment, we're going to look at these knowledge, understandings, and skills and procedures kind of in that formative way, in that ongoing documenting component where we are constantly giving feedback and checking in to see how what we can gather in that evidence can help us with the next steps in our instruction. There is an English language arts example here that I will leave for you in the slides so you can check it out. I'd like to just take a little moment and talk about optional versus required content. And so this is really about the foundations of really the curriculum and how we need to understand it. When you see including, you'll see down in this red box here, if you see the word including in an example, and it was up here, let's see, a transformation includes translations, rotations, and reflections. That means that you must address all of those bullet points within that particular example. It must be included. It's not optional, it is required. And there's an example here within the physical fitness, sort of physical education and wellness example. When you see such as, or for example, those pieces are optional. And so an example of that would be multiplication can be interpreted in various ways according to context, such as equal groups, an array, or an area. So in that circumstance, when it comes to assessment and practicing and using that data to inform our next steps, we can use different examples for different students or different time periods, or they could maybe demonstrate their understanding in one way, but they don't necessarily need to, you don't need to report out on all of those different pieces. Okay, so now that we've had a chance to think about the foundations, which are that the learning outcomes must be assessed and reported, and the CUSPs work really hard to support and hold up the foundation of that learning outcome. It gives you the content to play with and to work with. And we know that we're going to come up with an evaluation of those learning outcomes at some point. But I would invite you, my participants that are here with me today, I would invite you to join me in considering what some of the freedoms might be. What freedoms do you have within the realm of assessment in this context? You can turn on your mic or you can use the chat.
I can choose how I gather the evidence.
Yes.
Whether it be through a product or a conversation or an observation, like whether it be a project, whether it be a quiz, whether it be a journal response, I have choices how I deal with that.
Brilliant. So it could be a quiz, project, other way. Exactly. Any other thoughts about freedoms? I'm going to add that we can triangulate the data to inform our next steps, right? So we want to really look at how we gather that evidence, quiz project in other ways. So let's expand that and think about conversations that you have with students, observations that you make while they're working in groups or working independently, how they're solving problems, how they are articulating their ideas and the flow of their thinking. But it's also about the products of their learning or the performances that might include, a video recording or an opportunity to talk about a certain aspect that they could reflect on in a way that means something to them, how they can connect it to prior learning or that really landed in an emotional spot for them, so that resonated or had meaning for them. Within the freedoms, you also have opportunities to decide when to assess and in what format, which we've already mentioned. You also have lots of freedoms to think about the diversity of your students, and that not every student has to accomplish the same assessment. So how to meet varying student needs. They don't always have to do the same thing. You have the freedom to choose those types of things. Can anyone think of any other freedoms that you might have within this realm of assessment and reporting? Oh, thank you, Reggie. The how we communicate with students. How do you share feedback? How do you support their confidence and their learning through the process? Excellent. How we use assessment in a compassionate and kind way to really support a learner is an excellent contribution. So while we know what we have to assess, we have a lot of freedom to design the assessments in engaging and challenging ways that really help to take that learning and transfer it to new situations. Thank you for joining me to support that, Foundations and Freedoms. And now I'd like to offer a couple of just different tips and strategies for how you can really focus in on assessment for learning. Damien Cooper uses a really great example here about how as a teacher, we're in a unique position as opposed to, let's say, a figure skating coach. And so when a figure skater has a coach, that coach is responsible for all of these things like teaching new skills, adjusting the practice plan, guiding to inform, using feedback all the time, setting goals, celebrating, helping to develop a growth mindset, diagnosing what's the problem, and making connections to new skills. The judge, on the other hand, is not often the same person who does that coaching. The judge would give evaluative feedback, possibly comments, but nothing that they can really improve in that particular event. They would provide a grade or a level of achievement. They would know the criteria for which the assessment was being delivered, and they would place that value of the product or the performance against certain criteria. And as teachers, we have to do both of these roles. And so it's important to distinctly recognize when we are in one role or another. And the tools I'm going to provide for you today are definitely in the coach realm, because this is the place where we have the power to create some change and to give learning that opportunity to grow. So we always want to think about the strengths of our students and how we can support them from their strengths by meeting them where they are. And in as many ways as possible, as you said in the freedoms, we want to capture and harvest, we want to gather information, we want to notice what they're doing and thinking, and then we want to use it to inform our next steps. We mentioned triangulation of assessment data, and this slide here really talks about, and it draws from several different sources, but it talks about observations that can happen during the learning, performances, presentations, skills, demonstrations, captured through photos or videos or checklists, responding to questions. You can see the process playing out in a more fulsome way than you can from just a product. The discussions that you have either individually or with small or large groups, all of this informs what we know about a student's learning. We can also consider the products. Now, these are typically the forms of assessments that are most often used and sometimes exclusively used. But we really want to encourage that to broaden out, to include the other realms. So products could include any sort of project or assignment, a selection of questions that you want to practice in math. Could be a portfolio, a particular task, a test. Show what you know about a question or a concept. Now, these all count as well. And so now let's move over to this corner about conversations about learning. So those times where you're engaging with a group or you're giving feedback and watching to see if a student not only understands your feedback, but will do something with it. We can think about benchmarks, personal responses, self-assessments, recordings. All of these conversations can really have an influence and a role in triangulating the data so that we can really pinpoint what a student knows and can do. Now, why would you need all of these different areas? Damian Cooper, in his recent book called Rebooting Assessment, which is amazing and I highly recommend, he talks about how written products are often really strong at assessing knowledge. And when we listen to students and we dig deeply in with questions and prompts, and could you clarify that, or could you go in a little deeper, or could you tell me why you think that? Those are the kinds of conversations that reveal depth of understanding. And that's a really important thing because Alberta Education is asking us to evaluate and to provide assessment data on their understanding. So we have to dig in unique ways to be able to find that. When we observe students as they perform complex tasks that pull together knowledge and skills, we are actually able to make observations about their competencies. So their ability to problem solve, to communicate, to manage multiple sources of information. We're able to notice how they are using decision-making and using their critical thinking skills. And so it's really important that we do encourage a lot of different variation in the type of assessments and learning experiences that we design so that we can meet all of these needs. Here's one of the tools that I'd like to share with you today. And it comes from Damian Cooper's Rebooting Assessment, and it was adapted from a teacher's practice. And the way that she designed the layout for her, a sequence of learning, is to use diagnostic or pre-assessments to identify strengths and needs in each essential skill and concept. So through this red circle, you can imagine that there would be at least 2, but better to have 3 different ways of diagnosing where a student is at with a particular skill or understanding of a concept. And then throughout the learning, this light blue box in the center, or circle in the center, this is where you're always using ongoing monitoring and documenting strategies. So you're looking into students' products and experiences, you're capturing performances, and you're identifying learning and learning gaps. And you're doing something with that data. You're creating a space for students to take feedback and accept it. You're taking a chance to reevaluate your next steps, to make changes as necessary in response to students. And at the end of the learning, the assessment tasks would be differentiated. They might include an oral performance, an interview, and a written product, so that you really have a fulsome example of how that can all pull together. And so using this model, I've created an assessment sequence map that you can use just to kind of map out what are some of the ways that you can draw, can gather prior experience and knowledge. Have a couple of different ways. Maybe there's a group conversation. Maybe there is some sort of a learning task that asks students to draw on what they know. And I know there's a lot of boxes in here, but Every good learning experience is really, when it's well done, it can serve as an assessment for learning experience, because you're going to be able to reveal different pieces of information that you really need. And so you can just use quick jot notes or start to think about making sure that you're triangulating and that you're drawing from all of those 3 different elements during the process of learning, where you're giving them feedback and monitoring and documenting. And then finally, when it's time to provide that evaluation of the learning that's already happened, how might you triangulate that? So just having a little sense of mapping it out in a way that helps to keep our mind on the triangle, if you will. The next tool that I'd like to share with you is really amazing. It's called A Guide to Success. And it is not a rubric. It might look like it with the table format, but I assure you, this is meant to be a learning tool that would sit beside a student as they were working through a project or a task that has multiple steps. The first column on the left-hand side, these are like the foundations versus the freedoms. These are the must-dos. This is like put your name on it, make sure that you include 3 to 5 facts. This is, try to make it legible. This is the checklist of what you need to do. And this can help students manage their executive functioning skills, and you can chunk it according to what students can manage at one time. So at the beginning of an assessment or at the beginning of a task, you give them this guide to success as you go along and say, okay, here's your first things. The second box talks about assessment criteria. What do I need to do it well? Not all the different levels in the giant matrix and grid, but just what excellent looks like. How do I know that this will be done well? Then there's a spot for some student self-reflection, and you can modify this in any way that really suits your needs. What's going well, and what's my next step? And then, of course, there's a place for teacher feedback, where this is meant to be used in the middle of the learning, so that I can say, all right, your research is coming along really well. You need to go back and check on your sources and make this explanation of this supporting evidence more robust. Or maybe it's like you're in grade 2 and you're researching a small and crawly animal, and my feedback to you is some ways that you can make jot notes so that you don't have to write out whole sentences, or how do we cite our sources, those kinds of things. Now, the cool thing that I hope you will enjoy is that if you click on this image here, it will lead you to a Google folder that is called Guide to Success, and it's full of examples. And so you will see that there are blank versions that you can take. This one's a blank one here. Here is one that was designed around the they all came from Dr. Garfield Ginny Newman, and there's slight variations of them. But here's one around a mitten design. So the story called The Mitten. And the task requirement checklist was used at least 4 different materials, covers all of the areas of the mitten. This is a teacher tool, by the way, this particular one. And the criteria for excellence is here, and a little bit of teacher feedback can help to move along in that way. There is a couple of different ones that you can draw on. There's lots of different subjects represented in here, and there's a lot of different ways that you can try and use those as you go along. So I hope you will enjoy the Guide to Success and give it a try. Make it even better, make it useful for your students as you are working through the process. In summary, I just want to come back to, when we think about teaching and learning, the what is our curriculum as written, and it provides the content that we must address and report on to parents and Alberta education. But the how, this is where we as teachers have the pedagogical expertise and the know-how to meet students through ongoing assessment for learning, and we decide on the how. We have the liberty to meet students where they are and help to get them toward the target. We respond to the evidence, we make space to do something with that feedback. We create that feedback-rich culture that enables a growth mindset. We triangulate that data because we know that that's best practice. We hold the roles of both coach and judge, which is a precarious position with a lot of work and heart, but we do it really well. And so I offer all of these ideas to you, and remember that from our last session, Vietnam's Da Nang Golden Bridge shows us the way. We're holding that bridge to help students get there using tools and strategies such as these. I would like to open it up for questions or comments at this point. What questions do you have about assessment in the new curriculum? If you happen to be watching on the recording, you can reach out with an email or catch us on Twitter. Check out our website for other sessions and offerings. And I thank you very much for tuning in today. I will stay on for questions if you have any. And thanks again for your time and for all of your work.